Well, in this video we're going to have a look at the UK. We have actually had a little bit of good news from there as far as David Cameron goes, the Prime Minister. Years ago he said he wanted to run the greenest government ever. So we've gone from that to ditching the green crap. He's privately stated to people that he wants to get rid of all this green crap. The crap he's talking about is what's causing energy bills to skyrocket in the UK. You know, all these useless windmills and solar panels and all that. That's the green crap he's talking about. I suppose also he wants to avoid the attack from many people who are saying that thousands are dying because of his idiotic green policies. For example, 24,000 excess deaths in 2011-12, and last winter 31,000 excess deaths. So people are dying, dropping like flies in the UK, most of them old people, because of David Cameron's and the UK government's insane green policies, as outlined in the Climate Change Act 2008. The UK is now in this difficult position of having alarmists in control of the government, in particular the Secretary of State for Energy and Climate Change, Davey, who is a fervent believer in the catastrophic anthropogenic global warming fiction. Davey recently made a speech which was full of fear, fiction, alarmism, hysteria and pseudo-scientific drivel. He even quoted John Cook's 97% consensus, which has been debunked from all sides. And this is the type of nonsense that the UK's energy policy is now being decided on. In particular, they're looking at the IPCC reports over the years, which have got more and more hysterical. And now Ed Davies even talking about the Met Office. He said the Met Office has created a weather forecasting service which is the envy of the world. I mean, that is just a joke, because the Met Office has become a national laughingstock year after year for getting its long-term predictions of barbecue summers and milder than average winters totally wrong. Anyway, I don't want to spend too much time on Davey and his crackpot ideas or the Met Office. What we want to look at is some hard data and why that everyone thinks that there is a problem with the emissions of the West, when actually there isn't. It's the developing countries, in particular China, that is the problem, so we'll look into that now. Here we've got typical chart or picture that you see on the internet. NGOs and green groups love to put these up on their website and on the internet and on Wikipedia, so that you basically get misinformed. You get the wrong idea. They're basically saying that the US and Australia are the biggest climate criminals, they call us, in the world, followed by other Western countries. Look at tiny little China down there and India. Why would you jump on those two? They're so small. Basically what they're trying to do here is trick people into thinking that China, India and developing countries are not a problem. Of course what they're basically dealing is misinformation, deception and so on, to mislead, and that's their aim. What they're showing here is per capita emissions, and some of the charts you might see cumulative emissions, which really don't mean much. It's total emissions, of course, that matter. Here's another chart which they use quite often. They put this up and they show that China's tiny down the bottom, and there's USA massive up the top, and the UK is also a big problem up there, whereas in fact the emissions per capita have been dropping since the early 70s in both the USA and the UK. One thing that alarmists will never actually highlight is that US emissions, CO2 emissions have fallen dramatically, partly due to the recession, but mainly due to their switch to gas as a primary energy source, have now dropped to 1995 levels and are still falling. The UK's total emissions are falling as well and have been for many, many years. Which of course brings us to the elephant in the room, elephant one, which is China and other developing countries. Now China is where the emissions really are, and also where they are really growing extremely rapidly. This next chart is one that's very informative. Shows the change in emissions from 2005 to 2011 in million metric tons. China has increased massively, as you see there. They've gone up more than 3 billion tons in those years. India also has gone up dramatically, and Russia a little. And the ones down the bottom, which are Western countries, have all tried to cut their emissions because of their belief in CAGW. In particular, Europe have tried very hard to cut their emissions using these useless windmills and silly solar power, which doesn't work very well in Europe. They've got very poor amounts of sunlight. And that leads us to the real emissions. Not the dodgy ones, the fake ones, the ones that are meant to deceive and misinform, but these are the real actual emissions of key countries. UK, USA, China and Australia compared here. UK and Australia down the bottom, as you see there. Now the UK is about 1.7% of world emissions. Australia is about 1.5% of world emissions. USA has been going down recently and will probably continue to go down. But the key one to look at is China. China has gone up dramatically. China is undergoing the most rapid and dramatic industrialization in the history of the planet. I know we're supposed to be comparing China to the UK here, but the UK's coal consumption is that tiny, it'd be just dragging along the bottom of this chart. So we're comparing China to the US here, which is the second biggest consumer of coal on the planet. This is what's happened. 1965 to 2012, China's consumption of coal has skyrocketed. And this is the coal consumption of China compared to the rest of the world. These figures only go up to 2011. In fact, China has now equaled the global consumption of the rest of the world as far as coal goes. So China consumes as much coal as the entire rest of the world put together. And of course that is what has sent its emissions skyrocketing right off this chart here. Okay, so here we have a map of the world with anthropogenic CO2 emissions. You can see they're mostly concentrated around China, Japan, parts of India, Europe, a bit in the US, and a bit of a smattering everywhere else. Now this is probably one of the most important charts I want you to pay attention to, and that is some key countries compared. China, USA, Russia, Germany, Canada, UK and Australia. China's that big blue bit on the right, which is actually more emissions than all the rest put together. So China emits more CO2 than the USA, Russia, Germany, Canada, the UK and Australia combined. Okay, which brings us back to that little orange bit in the last chart, which is the UK and what it's doing to itself with this insane Climate Change Act. Over the last couple of decades, the UK has been, well, basically breaking itself, breaking the economy, damaging its living standards to try to reduce CO2 in a crazy way. The UK government has been taken in a big way by the IPCC, the UN, and its Kyoto Protocol targets. And the UK has decided, oh, we're even better than that. The UK government said, we can do better. We can slash emissions by 80% by 2050. This is a target in the Climate Change Act. And they're also trying to get to 35% by 2022. Totally insane, lunatic, fringe sort of ideas, but now they're mainstream in the UK government. Of course, no one else in the world is crazy enough to have such lunatic targets or even to attempt such a thing. The vast majority of the world's emitters are not bothering with any reductions at all. And the UK's cuts are going to make absolutely no difference whatsoever to world temperatures or to world emissions. China produces the UK's total annual emissions in 20 days. That's right, in 20 days. And just China's increase in emissions in a year is more than the UK's total yearly emissions. And on top of that, what the UK is trying to cut by 2022, which is 200 million tonnes, China emits that amount in a week, in 7 days. That's how crazy the whole thing is. But that's not the worst part. Now we'll move to Elephant 2, which is total CO2 emissions, natural and anthropogenic. Now here's a world map. This is not like the other one which someone has drawn. This is a satellite photograph. Now what it shows is total CO2 emissions, natural and anthropogenic, over land. So it shows where these CO2 emissions are coming from. And as you can see, most emissions are coming from the Amazon basin, from Central Africa and parts of Asia. The industrial areas are not represented. Industrial emissions from areas such as China, USA and Europe hardly even register. And here's some data about CO2 emissions from that well-known and well-trusted site, skepticalscience.com. There's the anthropogenic, that little blue wedge there, 35 gigatons, and we've got ocean emissions of CO2, 332 gigatons, and vegetation, 440 gigatons. So the total human emissions, anthropogenic, is 6% of total CO2 emissions. That's why it hardly registers on this map. So what the UK is in effect trying to do by 2022, at the cost of hundreds of billions of pounds, is trying to cut 200 megatons of emissions off 807,000 megatons of total CO2 emissions, which is a grand total of 1/4000th of the total CO2 emissions. I'm not sure whether the British people would consider that to be a very worthwhile investment. Let me know what you think.